Yes, so I'm delighted to be joined by Toby Young, who is the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union. So, Toby, thank you very much for your time. First
Thanks,
obvious
James.
question, why do you think Britain needs a free speech union?
Well, free speech has been under attack for some years now, and I think it needs an organisation to rally to its defence. I'll give you a few examples. There was a survey carried out by the UCU, the largest academic trade union, a few years ago, which compared free speech at Britain's universities to free speech at universities in other European Union member states, and it found that Britain was second from bottom. That is to say, free speech is less well protected in Britain, at Britain's universities, than in any other country in the European Union, bar one. Another example, there was an art survey published in the Times, actually, or written up in the Times a couple of months ago, whereby people who work in the arts and culture sector had been asked how much freedom of speech there was in their industry, and something like 80% said that they were expected to conform to a very narrow set of liberal ideas, and anyone who dissented from those progressive nostrums faced social excommunication or even career death. So that was pretty shocking. But perhaps the most shocking statistic is that in the past 5 years in England and Wales, 120,000 people have been investigated by the police for what the police refer to as non-crime hate incidents. That sounds like a phrase straight out of George Orwell's 1984, but actually it's real. And what it means is that if you say misgender someone on Twitter, you're not actually guilty of committing a crime. You are in fact just exercising your lawful right to free speech. But because it could lead to the committing of a hate crime somewhere down the line, the police will investigate any complaints and record what you've done as a non-crime hate incident, and that can show up when you apply. Let's say you apply for a job as a carer or a teacher, and your prospective employer does an enhanced DBS check. Those incidents can show up, and it could prevent you from getting a job. And that's 120,000 incidents that the police have investigated in the past 5 years in England and Wales. I worked out that's 67 per day over the past 5 years on average. And to think, we're in the midst of a knife crime epidemic, that the police are bothering to lavish such resources, so much time on investigating people misgendering each other on Twitter. I mean, it beggars belief. Why aren't they policing our streets, not our tweets?
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems to me that there are kind of two areas in which free speech is threatened. So the first is obviously when it's threatened by the state, so when the police investigate people and so on. And the second is when it's kind of done by civil society, so when you lose your job, you get threatened by your employee, that kind of thing. Do you think they're related, or do you think they're kind of quite separate things?
I think they're related. I think they're just across society. There is less and less tolerance for dissent from a fairly narrow range of prevailing orthodoxies, most of which are quite progressive. And I think that's partly because lots of left-wing lobby groups have succeeded in capturing various different state institutions. So the police, for instance, has been largely captured by organizations like Stonewall and Hope Not Hate, and Mermaids, which is a very energetic trans activist lobby group. And that just doesn't just apply to the police. It applies to the Home Office. It applies to the Department for Education. It applies to the CPS. Schools now are having to follow advice, which was introduced by the CPS recently, in which they're expected to report children for hate crimes if they engage in, name calling in the playground, things like that. I mean, it's just shocking the extent to which the state is taking on the role of policing our thoughts and punishing us for wrongthink.
Yeah. I mean, what's the reaction been? Have you been surprised by how much interest there's been?
Well, I've been pleasantly surprised by how much interest there's been. Yes, James. We launched in late February, and we already have 2,700 plus members. Lots of really good people have joined the Legal Advisory Council and the Media PR Advisory Council. So, for instance, a retired High Court judge has joined our Legal Advisory Council. There are lots of lawyers out there, it turns out, who care passionately about free speech and are prepared to offer their services pro bono to the Free Speech Union and its members whose free speech rights are being violated. And we've got an impressive group of academics, intellectuals, journalists, pundits who've joined our advisory council. And we've got a very impressive group of directors too. So Professor Nigel Bigger at Oxford, Douglas Murray, the author, fantastic young black free speech activist called Imaya Folarin Imam. So we've got some great people, and it feels almost as though there was an army out there just waiting for the trumpet call, ready to spring up and defend free speech. And I hope that's. I hope now we're going to make some gains.
What will be your main tactics? I mean, if someone feels their free speech has been violated, can they just come to you, or do they have to be a member? How exactly does it work?
Yeah, we tend to restrict our help to members because we get so many requests for help from our members that just dealing with them has become a full-time job for us. But sometimes, I mean, quite often, it's somebody who's a university student whose speech rights had been violated by the university authorities. So, for instance, we had a first-year student doing a journalism course at De Montfort University in Leicester. He got into a spat on Twitter with a left-wing activist, and it was fairly robust, but not particularly ill-humoured by Twitter standards. But this left-wing activist was unhappy with something this young student said to him, even though he was much older and has a successful career. And he complained to De Montfort University, and instead of just dismissing this complaint and saying nothing to do with us, nothing this student said was even a violation of Twitter's terms of service, which go much further than the law when it comes to restricting what you can say. But nonetheless, the university decided to investigate this complaint. They upheld the complaint, and they've now sanctioned the student and threatened him with expulsion if anything like this is repeated, which is quite absurd, particularly when you bear in mind that this is a student on a journalism course. If they're teaching journalism at De Montfort University, why aren't they teaching people about the importance, teaching their students about the importance of free speech? Anyway, so we've written a stiff letter on behalf of that young man who was a member of the Free Speech Union, essentially putting the investigating authorities at De Montfort on notice that should they sanction this student again for lawfully exercising his free speech, we will legally challenge them.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that obviously threats presumably to the free speech from the left and the right. I mean, do you think that there's more of a problem on the left? That's the impression I'm getting.
I think it's over time, it's changed. I think back in the 1950s, the enemies of free speech were, broadly speaking, on the right. Yeah. People like Mary Whitehouse, people like the Lord Chancellor who banned Lady Chatterley's lover, and so forth. But now it's undoubtedly true that there seems to be less understanding of the importance of free speech on the left than on the right. And Ira Glasser, the ex-head of the American Civil Liberties Union, which for a long time was a great champion of free speech in the United States. It's since been sort of captured by the woke cult and is less of a champion than it was. But back in the day when Ira Glasser was the head, he said, and he fought many important First Amendment battles, the First Amendment being the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which guarantees free speech. In the 1960s, had it not been for winning those landmark court cases, the civil rights movement never would have got off the ground. And Ira Glasser says that the problem with speech restrictions is that they may strike people as a useful weapon when they have the enemy in their sights on the battlefield, a bit like poison gas. But once you've released it, the wind can change. And I think that's what the left, what the current enemies of free speech are overlooking. They see restricting the speech of their ideological opponents as a useful weapon, because it's a weapon that they, being the overdogs, can now wield. But what they aren't anticipating is that it could very easily be a weapon used against them. So it's really in everyone's interest to uphold free speech, regardless of which way the political wind is blowing.
I mean, do you think free speech is mainly being attacked by the sections of the left because they have the whip hand, or because it's in their ideology? As I mean, if hypothetically universities were dominated by conservatives, I mean, a very different world. But if they were, do you think we'd have the same issues but the other way around, or do you think it's something specific to a form of left-wing ideology that creates this issue?
Well, it's possible that if instead of the left being dominant in universities, the right were dominant in universities, that they might be less enthusiastic about free speech than they are now. But I think it's doubtful. I think the reason the left isn't as enthusiastic about free speech as it might be, I think it's just in some cases a straightforward power play. They're dominant. They're in a position to restrict their ideological opponents from mounting intellectual challenges against their ideology, and so they're exercising that power in order to entrench their ideological hegemony. I also think it's based on a kind of misunderstanding. Many elements of the social justice left, in particular the extreme regressive left, seem to think that there is a real conflict between free speech and the rights of minorities, of historically marginalized groups. They think that when people like me talk about free speech, they're really just talking about male, pale and stale conservatives being able to kind of spout bile with no consequences to the detriment of historically marginalized groups like women, blacks, gays, trans people, and so forth. But that, I think, is a fundamental misconception, a false dichotomy. As Ira Glasser, the ex-head of the ACLU, has pointed out, many of the important minority rights that have been won over the past 50 years wouldn't have been won without free speech. And I don't think there is a fundamental conflict between viewpoint diversity and other forms of diversity. I think the two go hand in hand. And the sooner we can debunk this idea that free speech too often equals hate speech, and free speech isn't in the interests of minorities, just the kind of privileged white male overclass, the sooner we can do that, the better.
Yeah. Now, whilst obviously at the moment the left has a lot of cultural power in things like universities and the media and so on, they don't actually have political power. They don't control the government, which potentially they could have done had Jeremy Corbyn won in December. I mean, had we had a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn, how big a threat do you think that specifically could have been to free speech?
Yeah, I think that had Jeremy Corbyn won the general election, then free speech would be in even greater jeopardy than it is at present. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn has ever shown any appreciation for the importance of free speech. And as we know historically, whenever a hard left party wins an election and achieves power, one of the first things they do is start using the law to shut down opposition, whether it's closing newspapers, banning demonstrations, or, in due course, as has happened on too many occasions, the rounding up and imprisonment of their opponents. And I don't. People may think it's an exaggeration to say that a Corbyn-led Labour government would have done that. Maybe they wouldn't have done it straight away, but in due course, I wouldn't be surprised if they did start rounding up their intellectual enemies under one pretext or another. But having said all that, James, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that the conservative parties that have consistently been winning elections across Europe and in the United States have any real appreciation for free speech either. Because even though politically the right has been on the winning side. Nonetheless, free speech has been gradually but consistently eroded across the Anglosphere. So winning the battle at the ballot box doesn't seem to be sufficient. I think things would have certainly been worse had Jeremy Corbyn won the last general election, but things are by no means rosy in the garden, even though the Conservatives won the last general election. So there's still a great deal to do.
I mean, do you think there should be any restrictions on free speech other than incitement to violence?
I think that the First Amendment of the US Constitution gets it right, and the First Amendment essentially says anything goes apart from direct incitement to violence against specific groups or individuals. If you can't show that allowing someone to exercise their right to free speech is going to immediately lead to violence being committed against a specific individual or a specific group, then I think you're hard pressed to justify restricting people's free speech.
Yeah. Now, obviously, there are quite a lot of groups that think their free speech are being infringed we may not agree with. So I'm thinking, for example, in universities, Islamist fundamentalists. I mean, I think Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is an Islamist group, is on the NUS's no platform list, as well as lots of right-wing conservative groups. And would you be prepared to extend support to groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, who have very extreme Islamist views, but who stop short of inciting violence?
Yes, I think that the prevent duty imposed on public institutions, including universities, by the Anti-Terrorism Act passed under Tony Blair's government, does go too far in restricting free speech on universities. I don't think it's enough to show that allowing a particular person, a particular group to speak may, in due course, under certain circumstances, lead to violence. That's not sufficient. That's too low a bar. I think in order to justify restricting someone from speaking, you have to show that allowing them to speak will lead directly to violence being committed, and you have to identify who it's going to be committed against. If you leave it vaguer than that, then that creates a doorway through which you can restrict the free speech of lots and lots of people. For instance, I've heard the argument that Jacob Rees-Mogg shouldn't be permitted to speak on campus because his views on immigration and the European Union could whip up xenophobia and racism, and that in turn could lead to an upsurge in violent hate crimes. And it's, because it could do this and it could do that, and if the circumstances conspire in a particular way, it could lead to this. That's insufficient. You can't ban speech on those grounds. It would be like, people make the argument that Boris shouldn't have been permitted to make the jokes that he made in his now notorious Daily Telegraph column, in which he compared burqa-wearing Muslim women to bank robbers and letterboxers. People claim that that led to a surge in hate crime. Well, actually, the evidence that it did is extremely threadbare. But I don't think you can't say that because it could have led to increased violence against Muslim women, he therefore shouldn't have been allowed to say that, or should be prosecuted for saying it, or kicked out of the Conservative Party for saying it. That would be, I think, completely over the top. And so, yeah, I do have some sympathy with Muslim groups who are banned from speaking at universities and in other institutions, part funded by the taxpayer, under the prevent duty. I think it does go too far.
Yeah. I mean, whilst usually, or quite a lot, it's obviously conservative groups or conservative individuals who feel their free speech is being infringed. I mean, also, I guess, feminists with the trans issue. One other group that I've noticed increasingly is a section of the hard left on the anti-Semitism issue, i.e. that they feel that their comments are being used against them beyond what is acceptable. I mean, do you think that, would you be prepared to support someone in the Labour Party accused of anti-Semitism if it stops short of inciting violence?
Well, I think the issue for the Labour Party is often whether what someone has said breaches the Conservative Party's internal rules as opposed to the law. And I do think that within reason, organisations should be allowed to introduce internal speech codes, which they can reasonably expect their members to adhere to. And I think in the Labour Party's case, they are a political party seeking public office. And so I think it's reasonable for them to have a set of internal rules which prohibits various forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, and any members guilty of breaching those rules, I think the party is entitled to kick out. I think in some cases it may be that the Labour Party's gone too far. If someone who has been kicked out of the Labour Party, who feels that they didn't break the internal rules and is just being purged for political reasons, then I think we would come to their support. I'll give you an example. Trevor Phillips, the legendary anti-racism campaigner and the chair of Index on Censorship, which is a fantastic pro-free speech organisation, not a membership organisation like us, but does great work nonetheless. He's recently been threatened with expulsion from the Labour Party for Islamophobia. Now, if you look at the charge sheet against him, it's pretty clear that they are trumped up charges and that they've only been brought against him because he's considered an ideological enemy by Corbyn and his fellow travellers. And one of the things the Free Speech Union has done is to start a petition on change.org standing up for Trevor Phillips's right to free speech. I think too often people seeking to restrict the speech rights of their political opponents will throw around words like Islamophobia, will make claims about anti-Semitism, when in fact the people concerned aren't really guilty of those things. They're just pretexts, they're just smears, ways to try and shut them up because you don't like what they're saying.
Yeah. Now, we've heard quite a bit from the Conservative government recently about protecting free speech. Now, I know you kind of alluded to this earlier, this isn't sufficient, but about protecting free speech in universities. I mean, do you think that their plans are serious? And do you think that Britain needs a kind of version of the First Amendment?
Well, I think the government probably is serious about wanting to see free speech upheld more vigorously at Britain's universities. But I don't think that what's needed are more acts of parliament, because there are plenty of laws on the statute books which oblige universities to uphold free speech. For instance, there's the 1986 Education Act. Clause 43 places a legal duty on universities to make sure free speech is upheld on their campuses. There's Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is embodied in British law by the Human Rights Act. So there are plenty of laws on the statute books requiring universities to make sure free speech is upheld. The problem is that those laws aren't enforced. Nearly all universities, if not all, have lots of very high-sounding declarations of principle on their website, in their articles of association, proclaiming their undying commitment to free speech. The problem, James, is that these principles are more often honoured in the breach than the observance. And one of the things I hope the Free Speech Union can do is hold universities' feet to the fire. So if they don't uphold their own principles, we can point that out and try and force them to do so. And we have had one small victory in that respect. I don't know if you recall, but last month, Amber Rudd, the former Conservative MP and ex-Home Secretary, was no-platformed by a student society at Oxford. She was notified about this after she'd arrived to give the talk she'd been invited to give by this feminist society. After she'd arrived, they notified her that the talk had been cancelled. Really quite shocking, rude behaviour, and really unacceptable for a university society to invite someone to speak and then, after various protesters object, to withdraw the invitation. That's essentially handing protesters the right to stop someone speaking whose views they disagree with. the Free Speech Union wrote a letter of complaint to the Oxford University proctors, who are responsible for making sure, amongst other things, that student societies abide by university rules. And we pointed out that it had broken various university rules regarding the upholding of free speech. And I sent it off without a great deal of hope, because this kind of thing happens at Oxford all too frequently. But actually, the proctor's office wrote back to me about a week later and said that my complaint had been upheld, and they had ordered the Feminist Society in question to issue an apology to Amber Rudd, and they had deregistered the society, so it will no longer be able to use university rooms. It won't be eligible for university funding, and it won't be able to use the university name. So that was a small victory, but I hope we can chalk up many more in the months and years to come.
I mean, just one final question. So I saw, especially over the Amber Rudd case, I noticed that there was some criticism from elements of the left. So I noticed, for example, Nick Lowles from Hope Not Hate was very outspoken about this being, a disgrace and an attack on free speech and so on. And there's part of me that wondered, is this a sign that the tide's turning, or am I being overly optimistic? What do you think?
I think you're being overly optimistic. I think, it's very easy to think the tide is turning. People thought the tide was turning when the Conservatives won a thumping majority back in December, when Ricky Gervais gave his fantastic opening monologue at the Golden Globes back in January, which was a sort of hysterical attack on all kinds of woke nonsense. People thought, aha, the tide is turning. If I had a pound for every time I've heard that phrase, I'd be a rich man. The truth is that the tide is currently still running against us, and I hope the Free Speech Union can make a small difference, but it's going to take a lot of concerted, organised action on behalf of all of us who believe in free speech to turn the tide. I think it's a generational battle. As Ronald Reagan said, the battle for liberty has to be won afresh by each new generation, and I'm afraid it falls to my generation, who can still remember just why free speech is so valuable, to persuade the younger generation of why it's so important, and to go on and win that battle. But it's going to take years, I'm afraid, possibly decades.
Well, on that note, I mean, so thank you very much for your time.